Flyaway Peter is an Australian novella written by David Malouf in 1982. It is set during and before the First World War. The first part of the novella is set on the Queensland Gold Coast and the second part is based in the Western Front in Europe. This story largely revolves around the character of Jim Sadler, who has an advanced understanding of the bird life in an estuary near his home. Jim holds a deep connection to nature and the earth and therefore is detached from humanity. A man called Ashley Crowther inherits the land the estuary is located on and employs Jim to record the bird life. Both characters form a strong bond with one another through their interest in nature. Jim also befriends an older woman called Imogen. They form a partnership in which she photographs the birds as he records them. However, the outbreak of World War I causes Jim to join the army, where his character develops from an individual with a naive, unrealistic view of the world to self-realization and the ability to gain a true image of humanity and its horrors.
When Jim's team moves into the Armentiers, a realisation is made where Jim sees the poor state in the inhabitants live. He previously believed the world was a utopia in which no injustice existed because of his old way of life, which consisted mostly of birdwatching and outdoor activities. However, the experience of war has changed his point of view in regard to the world and enabled him to become more aware of the injustices. But the text says they were grim, wooden-faced people in clothes as muggy and ragged as soldiers, their feet sometimes in clogs but often in bundles of rags. The novella is able to demonstrate both the feelings possessed by the locals about war and the state in which they live. The image of the wooden-faced people debunks the idea that the defenders in the war were welcomed with open arms. In fact, the horrors of war would commonly transform men into the monsters which raped women and stole from villages. Where the text says they were always on the lookout for something to eat or steal, the text is demonstrating the fact that the defenders did not fulfill their purpose. Although fighting in the war, the soldiers lost their sense of morality that they possessed in a typical ethical, educated society. The horrors of war were able to dehumanize soldiers and strip them of their identity and turn them into sheep whose sole purpose was to kill. Furthermore, where the lines of the novella read, "or for a woman who could be induced into one of the dirty barns," the text is making a reference to the regularity of rape against women who lived in these war-affected areas. Additionally, the fact that the local people would wear bundles of rags on their feet is representative of their financial hardship. It's able to display that they could not afford proper shoes because of the economic disadvantages imposed on the town by the war.
The character of Imogen Harcourt is one of significance, as she represents the part of society, including the families and loved ones of those gone to war who were left behind. Imogen represents this as both close male figures in her life. Jim and Ashley leave her to pursue a part in the war effort. Through her character, we can observe the grief of the families when a loved one does not return home. Quote, "She had wanted to say more, to say that she understood a little of what he might feel, for that 2 whole days after she had heard, she had not been able to move." Imogen's reaction to the news of Jim's death represents how significant the suffering of loved ones left behind was. Before Jim's involvement of World War I, he is presented as innocent, naive, and a simplistic individual with an observably deep connection to nature and the land. Jim's fixation of the earth and all its creatures, in particular the bird life, is observably passionate, to the extent that he holds himself in a symbiotic relationship with the species around him. "He was on his belly again" is symbolic of this close relationship. The book is another symbol portraying Jim's connection to nature, as it is a direct reference to the Bible. Jim's experience with nature is not only spiritual but can be considered as his religion. Due to this connection, Jim's character can be observed as being detached from other people, with him feeling little connection to his fellow man. When he talked to Miss Harcourt, as when he talked to Ashley Crowther, they spoke only of the birds. This shows how Jim much prefers the company of the natural world to interactions with other people. And in the few instances where he does talk to Ashley and Imogen, it is on the topic of nature. Before the influence of Jim's experience with the war, a significant aspect of his personality and values on life are utopian and idealistic.
In the text, where Jim is shown in his first few moments of the war, he is seen to have found something which he finds comfort in. With the lines of the novella read, "Dunlin," he said, "she could have laughed outright at the newness of the old word, how that it had arrived on this side." The text is able to demonstrate the displacement of people and nature in the war through the use of metaphor. The metaphor of a dunlin is representative of all people who have been displaced and become refugees as a result of the war. The dunlin bird is usually found on the opposite side of the world, Jim explains, and its appearance here is astounding to him. It's representative of how it's necessary to migrate in order to survival in times of war. In the later section of the text, the reader discovers a new side of Jim. He transforms from the innocent person which is seen at the start of the novella, living in a utopia, to a state of experience in which he has experienced the horrors of war. One place in which we see Jim undergoing change is the scene portrayed in chapter 12, where Jim is drenched in blood. This scene is highly contrasting with the previous lifestyle Jim had, watching birds and observing nature because of its blatant, gory nature. The gore of being drenched in blood is a symbol of the fragility of life with which it is extinguished.
During Chapter 9, before entering the trenches and experiencing the front line, we are introduced to Whizzer Green, who is another soldier in Jim's company. Whizzer is presented as being a projection of masculinity, oozing a large male confidence and ego when compared to an innocent and naive Jim. Whizzer is introduced through a dispute with Jim, where both men are engaged in a near fight, in which Whizzer tripped Jim and then accused him of deliberately getting in the way. Through this, we can observe Whizzer projecting his dominance over Jim in an overtly confident and masculine way. However, the next time we encounter Whizzer is sometime after they have had their first experience in the frontline trenches. The conditions in which the soldiers had been living in for the past weeks had been described as horrific, with earth that refused to keep its shape or stay still, grimly unwashed, and having body lice that bred in the seams of their clothes. If this wasn't terrible enough, there was a constant bombardment of falling shells, the persistent rattle of gunfire, and the sight of their fellow soldier being shot and blown to pieces around them. By this time, those horrors of war have gotten to Whizzer, and his demeanour had completely shifted. Whizzer began to quake. An odd moaning sound came from between the man's clenched teeth. He is now presented as being completely broken and less overtly masculine as he was seen before. In this situation, Whizzer is no longer exerting his manly dominance over Jim, as he is described as he had drawn himself up into a ball and was rocking back and forth. This demonstrates Whizzer's loss of confidence in that he is so fearful he has resorted to a defensive position, trying to make himself look weaker and smaller. Whizzer represents the effect of war on the individual and how the horrors break down a soldier's masculinity until it crumbles away completely.